You've been told World War I started because a Serbian nationalist shot an Austrian archduke in Sarajevo. And yes, that assassination was the spark. But I want to show you the dry forest. Because there was a piece of infrastructure most people have never heard of, a railway that explains why Britain treated a Balkan crisis as an existential threat, why the Ottoman Empire became a target, and why the Middle East was carved up the way it was. Not because history is a conspiracy, because empires have incentives. Britain didn't run the world with armies. It ran it with choke points. And Germany was trying to build a route that made those choke points irrelevant. The Berlin-Baghdad Railway. The victors wrote the syllabus. This railway didn't make the syllabus. Because if you understand what this railway really represented, everything you think you know about the 20th century starts to unravel. The entire Middle East, the borders you see on maps today, the conflicts that have raged for 100 years, they all trace back to Britain's determination to ensure this railway never succeeded. In the early 20th century, if you wanted to trade between Europe and Asia, you had two options. You could sail around Africa through waters patrolled by British warships, or you could use the Suez Canal, which Britain controlled after 1882. Either way, Britain collected the fees, monitored the cargo, and maintained near total visibility over the most valuable trade lanes. Then Germany proposed something unthinkable. A railway line that would run from Berlin, through the Balkans, across the Ottoman Empire, through Mesopotamia, all the way to Baghdad, and then down to Basra on the Persian Gulf. Trains instead of ships. Land instead of sea. A route that would completely bypass British naval power, completely bypass the Suez Canal, completely bypass every choke point that gave Britain control over East-West trade. Germany couldn't outbuild the Royal Navy. But it didn't need to. It only needed one route the Royal Navy couldn't touch. A blockade only works if the enemy needs the ocean. Therefore, Germany didn't build battleships first. It built a corridor. This was Britain's nightmare scenario. And the British didn't just oppose this railway. They orchestrated, over 15 years, a systematic campaign of financial sabotage, diplomatic isolation, propaganda warfare, and ultimately military destruction to ensure this railway never fulfilled its purpose. They backed Arab revolts. They seized Ottoman territories. They carved up the Middle East into artificial states designed to remain weak and divided. And when a regional crisis finally arrived, Britain used it as the opportunity to settle the railway question permanently. What you're about to hear isn't a conspiracy theory. This is documented history. The British were explicit about their strategic concerns. They wrote memos, they held parliamentary debates, they published policy papers explaining exactly why this railway had to be stopped. The evidence is overwhelming. But it's evidence that challenges the comfortable narrative we've been taught about the Great War, about imperialism, about the Middle East. So it gets left out of the textbooks. It gets buried in academic journals. And most people go through their entire lives never knowing that the world they live in, the conflicts they see on the news, the borders that divide nations, all of it stems from Britain's determination to destroy one railway line. Let's start with the railway itself. What exactly was the Berlin-Baghdad Railway, and why did it matter so much? In 1899, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany stepped off a train in Constantinople and announced a bold vision. Germany would finance and build a railway line connecting Berlin to the Ottoman capital, and from there, the line would extend south and east, through Anatolia, across Mesopotamia, all the way to Baghdad, and eventually to Basra on the Persian Gulf. This wasn't just a railway. This was a continental bridge, a steel artery that would transform the geopolitics of Eurasia. The technical ambition was staggering. The route would cover more than 2,000 miles, crossing mountain ranges, deserts, and multiple climate zones. It would require hundreds of tunnels, thousands of bridges, entire new cities built along the route to supply and maintain the infrastructure. Deutsche Bank, Germany's most powerful financial institution, would organize the financing. German engineers would design the system. German corporations would supply the steel, the locomotives, the technical expertise, and the Ottoman Empire would provide the land, the labor, and the legal framework to make it all possible. But the technical details, impressive as they were, missed the point entirely. What mattered wasn't how the railway would be built. What mattered was what the railway would do. And what it would do was fundamentally reshape the economic geography of the world. Think about global trade in 1900. If you were a German manufacturer and you wanted to sell machinery to India, you had to ship it by sea. Your cargo would travel from Hamburg, down through the English Channel, across the Bay of Biscay, around the entire western coast of Africa, around the Cape of Good Hope, across the Indian Ocean, and finally to Bombay or Calcutta. Months of travel time, massive shipping costs, and every step of that journey put you at the mercy of British naval power. Now imagine instead that you could load your cargo onto a train in Berlin and it arrives in Basra dramatically faster weeks instead of months. From Basra, it's a short voyage across the Persian Gulf to India, a voyage that doesn't require passing through any British-controlled waters. You've cut travel time dramatically, you've reduced costs, and, most importantly, you've eliminated British control over your trade. That's what the Berlin-Baghdad Railway promised. It was an economic weapon disguised as an infrastructure project. And it wasn't just about trade, it was about resources. In 1900, the internal combustion engine was just beginning to transform warfare and industry. Oil was still a minor commodity, mostly used for lighting. But a few visionaries understood that oil would soon become the most strategic resource on Earth. And where was the oil? It was in Persia, in Mesopotamia, in the lands between the Mediterranean and the Persian Gulf. The Ottoman Empire sat on top of what would later be recognized as the world's largest petroleum reserves. But in 1900, there was no way to extract that oil and get it to European markets except by ship through waters controlled by Britain. The Berlin-Baghdad Railway would change that equation entirely. Oil could be piped to the railway line, loaded onto tanker cars, and shipped directly to Central Europe without ever leaving land. Germany wouldn't need Britain's permission. Germany wouldn't need to worry about British blockades. Germany would have secure, direct access to the energy resources that would power 20th century industry and warfare. This wasn't just an economic threat to Britain. This was a mortal threat to the entire structure of British imperial power. And there was something else, something even more dangerous from Britain's perspective. The railway would make the Ottoman Empire viable again. For 50 years, European powers had been waiting for the Ottoman Empire to collapse. They called it the sick man of Europe, a dying patient whose lands would soon be carved up among the great powers. But what if the patient didn't die? What if, instead of collapsing, the Ottoman Empire modernized, industrialized, and integrated its vast territories into a coherent economic system? The railway would do exactly that. It would connect Constantinople to Baghdad, Baghdad to the Gulf to the wider world. As a result, it would allow the Ottomans to move troops quickly, to suppress rebellions, to exploit their own resources, to tax trade flowing through their lands. The Ottoman Empire would become a major power again, not through military conquest, but through infrastructure. For Germany, this was the opportunity of a lifetime. Germany was the late arrival to European imperialism. By the time Germany unified in 1871, Britain and France had already colonized most of Africa and Asia. There wasn't much left to conquer. But Germany didn't need to conquer new territories if it could partner with an existing empire that controlled one of the most strategic regions on Earth. The Ottoman Empire stretched from the Balkans to the Arabian Peninsula, from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf. An alliance with the Ottomans would give Germany everything it needed: markets, resources, and a land route to the east that bypassed British naval power entirely. Kaiser Wilhelm saw this clearly. In 1898, he made a highly publicized visit to the Ottoman Empire, traveling to Constantinople, Jerusalem, and Damascus. In Damascus, he gave a speech declaring himself the protector of the world's 300 million Muslims. It was propaganda, obviously, but it was effective propaganda. The message was clear. Germany and the Ottoman Empire would stand together against European colonialism. Germany would provide capital, technology, and diplomatic support. The Ottomans would provide land access and strategic partnership. Together, they would build a new world order that didn't revolve around British naval supremacy. The British understood exactly what was happening. As early as 1902, British intelligence reports were warning that the Berlin-Baghdad Railway represented a fundamental challenge to British interests in the Middle East and India. One memo, written by a Foreign Office official, put it bluntly: if this railway is completed, British control over the route to India becomes meaningless. Another report, this one from the British military, warned that the railway would allow Germany to project military power into regions that Britain had always considered its exclusive sphere of influence. The Ottoman army, equipped with German weapons and transported by German railways, could threaten Egypt, threaten Persia, even threaten India itself. These weren't paranoid fantasies. These were sober assessments by British strategists who understood that infrastructure is power. For 300 years, Britain had controlled global trade by controlling the sea lanes. The Royal Navy was the most powerful military force on Earth, not because British ships could defeat any other navy in direct combat, but because British naval dominance made it impossible for rivals to trade freely. Britain didn't need to conquer the whole world. It just needed to control the choke points: Gibraltar, Suez, the Strait of Hormuz, the Strait of Malacca. Control the choke points, and you control everything. But the Berlin-Baghdad Railway eliminated the choke points. It created a route that didn't depend on British-controlled waters, which meant Britain's entire imperial system was suddenly vulnerable. This is the context that explains everything that came after. The British response to the railway wasn't a matter of policy preference or diplomatic disagreement. It was existential. If the railway succeeded, British power would decline. The empire would lose its ability to dominate global trade. India, the crown jewel of the empire, would become vulnerable to land-based threats. British financial supremacy would erode. Everything Britain had built over 3 centuries would be at risk. So the British made a decision. This railway could not be allowed to succeed. Not slowed down, not modified, not negotiated over. Stopped, destroyed, prevented from ever fulfilling its purpose. And if stopping the railway required destroying the Ottoman Empire, Britain was prepared to do that too. What followed was one of the most sophisticated campaigns of imperial sabotage in history. A 15-year effort to ensure that the Berlin-Baghdad Railway never connected Berlin to the Persian Gulf. To understand why the railway posed such an overwhelming threat to Britain, you need to understand how British imperial power actually worked. It wasn't just about colonies and military force, but armies only matter if you can supply them. Therefore, the British Empire was fundamentally a system of control over trade routes, backed by naval power and financial dominance. For 3 centuries, Britain had structured the global economy around a simple principle. If you want to trade with Asia, you go through us. And the physical manifestation of that principle was the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal opened in 1869, connecting the Mediterranean to the Red Sea and cutting thousands of miles off the voyage from Europe to India. It was built by the French, but in 1882, Britain effectively seized control of Egypt, and with it, control of the canal. From that moment forward, the Suez Canal wasn't just infrastructure, it was a weapon. Every ship that passed through paid fees to Britain. Every cargo manifest was inspected by British officials. Every government that relied on trade with Asia had to maintain friendly relations with Britain or risk having their ships blocked from the canal. This gave Britain extraordinary leverage over global politics. When Italy angered Britain in 1896, British officials quietly suggested that Italian ships might face delays passing through Suez. Italy backed down. When Russia wanted to send warships from the Baltic to the Pacific during the Russo-Japanese War, Britain refused passage through Suez, forcing the Russian fleet to sail around Africa, adding months to the voyage. Russia lost the war partly because its ships arrived too late and too exhausted to fight effectively. Britain didn't need to fire a shot. Control of the canal was enough. And the canal was just one piece of a larger system. Britain controlled Gibraltar, which guarded the entrance to the Mediterranean. Britain controlled Aden, which guarded the entrance to the Red Sea. Britain controlled the Persian Gulf through protectorate agreements with local Arab sheikhs. Britain controlled Singapore and the Strait of Malacca, the gateway between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific. Britain controlled Cape Town and the route around Africa. Everywhere you looked, Britain had positioned itself at the choke points, the narrow passages that trade had to flow through. This wasn't accidental. This was the product of centuries of strategic calculation. The British understood something that other empires missed. You don't need to conquer the whole world. You just need to control the roads and the intersections. Let other people farm the land, mine the resources, manufacture the goods. Britain would control how those goods moved from place to place. That's where the real power lay. And behind the naval bases and the canal zones was another layer of control: finance. The Bank of England, established in 1694, had become the most powerful financial institution on earth. British capital financed railways in Argentina, mines in South Africa, factories in India. When governments needed loans, they went to London. When companies wanted to raise money, they listed on the London Stock Exchange. The pound sterling was the international reserve currency, which meant that central banks around the world held British pounds as backing for their own currencies. This created a system where Britain could punish rivals simply by restricting credit or manipulating currency markets. The Ottoman Empire knew this system intimately. By 1875, the Ottomans had borrowed so much money from European banks that they couldn't pay the interest on their debts. The empire was bankrupt. So the European powers, led by Britain and France, imposed something called the Ottoman Public Debt Administration. This was an international organization staffed by European officials that took control of Ottoman tax revenues. Every year, the Ottoman government would collect taxes, and before that, money could be spent on schools or hospitals or the military. It had to be handed over to the Public Debt Administration, which would then distribute it to European bondholders. This wasn't accidental. This was colonialism without conquest. The Ottoman Empire remained nominally independent. The Sultan still sat on his throne in Constantinople. But the empire's finances were controlled by foreigners, which meant its policies were controlled by foreigners. It was like having a government, but your tax money goes straight to your creditors before you can pay your own army. By 1881, a staggering 62% of Ottoman government revenues were being transferred directly to European bondholders before the Ottoman state could spend a single coin on its own administration. Therefore, when the Ottomans wanted to build railways or develop oil fields, they had to get permission from the Public Debt Administration. And the administration, dominated by British and French officials, only approved projects that benefited British and French interests. This is the context in which Germany's offer to finance the Berlin-Baghdad Railway became so appealing to the Ottomans. Here was a European power willing to invest in Ottoman infrastructure without demanding control over Ottoman finances. Deutsche Bank was offering loans, yes, but loans that would be paid back through railway revenues, not through Ottoman tax dollars. The Ottoman government would maintain sovereignty. The empire would modernize on its own terms. This was a chance to escape the debt trap that Britain and France had engineered. Sultan Abdul Hamid II, who ruled from 1876 to 1909, saw the railway as an opportunity to save his empire. He had watched for 30 years as European powers chipped away at Ottoman territory. Greece had gained independence. Romania had gained independence. Bulgaria had gained autonomy. Egypt, nominally still part of the empire, was under British occupation. The Ottomans had lost control of their own finances. They were being bled dry by European bondholders. The empire was dying, and everyone knew it. But the railway could change that. If the Ottomans could connect their territories with modern infrastructure, they could move troops quickly to suppress rebellions. They could exploit their own resources instead of relying on European capital. They could tax trade instead of watching European merchants move goods through Ottoman lands without paying a penny to the empire. The railway wasn't just about economic development. It was about survival. Abdul Hamid understood that if the empire didn't modernize, it would be carved up, and Germany was offering the tools for modernization. For Germany, the calculation was equally clear. Germany had industrialized rapidly in the late 19th century, but it lacked colonies to supply raw materials and absorb surplus industrial production. Britain controlled India, Egypt, and much of Africa. France controlled Algeria and Indochina. Even Belgium had carved out a vast colony in the Congo. Germany had a few territories in Africa and the Pacific, but nothing that could rival the colonial holdings of Britain or France. Kaiser Wilhelm II, who became emperor in 1888, was obsessed with this disparity. He wanted Germany to be a world power, a Weltmacht, but he couldn't compete with Britain at sea. The British Royal Navy was too strong. Any attempt to match British naval power would trigger an arms race that Germany couldn't win. So Wilhelm looked for an alternative strategy. Instead of challenging Britain on the oceans, Germany would challenge Britain on land. Instead of colonizing new territories, Germany would partner with an existing empire that controlled strategic land in the heart of Eurasia. The Ottoman Empire was perfect for this role. It was weak enough to need German help, but large enough to matter geopolitically. It controlled the overland routes between Europe and Asia. And most importantly, it was desperate. The Ottomans needed a European ally who wasn't trying to colonize them, and Germany needed an ally that could provide land access to resources and markets. It was a match made in strategic heaven. In 1888, the first step was taken when a German company was granted the concession to build a railway from Constantinople to Ankara. This was a small line, just a few hundred miles, but it established the precedent. German capital, German engineers, German control over Ottoman infrastructure. Then in 1899, the big prize, Deutsche Bank secured the concession for the full Berlin-Baghdad Railway. The contract was for 99 years. Germany would finance and build the railway, and in return, Germany would receive revenues from railway operations, plus a massive corridor of land and mineral rights running the length of the route. It was the deal of the century, and Britain reacted with alarm. In 1900, Lord Curzon, the Viceroy of India and one of Britain's most influential imperial strategists, wrote a memo that laid out the stakes with brutal clarity. Curzon argued that if the Berlin-Baghdad Railway was completed, Germany would gain direct access to the Persian Gulf, which would threaten British control over the Indian Ocean. He wrote, "The railway will place Germany in a position to move troops and material to the Gulf with a rapidity which we cannot equal by sea. The railway would allow Germany to move troops and supplies to the Gulf in days, while British reinforcements from India would take weeks to arrive by sea. In a crisis, Germany would have the advantage." More broadly, Curzon warned, the railway would establish Germany as the dominant power in the Middle East, displacing Britain from a region that Britain had always considered vital to the defense of India. Other British officials echoed these concerns. In 1903, a Foreign Office memorandum stated that the railway would give Germany control over the route to India, which would fundamentally alter the balance of power in Asia. In 1907, a British military intelligence report concluded that the railway represented the gravest strategic threat to British interests since the rise of Napoleon. These weren't exaggerations. British strategists understood that naval supremacy didn't mean anything if rivals could bypass the seas entirely. And there was another factor that terrified British planners: oil. In 1901, a British prospector named William Knox D'Arcy negotiated an oil concession with the Persian government, giving him exclusive rights to explore for oil in most of Persia. This was the beginning of what would later become the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, the predecessor to BP. The British government quickly realized that oil was the energy source of the future. In 1912, Winston Churchill, as First Lord of the Admiralty, made a decisive commitment. The Royal Navy would convert its entire fleet from coal to oil. This made British warships faster and gave them greater range, but it also created a strategic dependency. A coal fleet can refuel from domestic mines. An oil fleet has to guard a pipeline thousands of miles away. Britain produced almost no oil domestically. Therefore, the Royal Navy's supremacy now depended on controlling foreign oil supplies. Most of the world's known oil reserves in the early 20th century were in the Middle East, particularly in Persia and Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, was part of the Ottoman Empire. If Germany gained control over Mesopotamia through the railway, Germany would control the oil. And if Germany controlled the oil, Britain's fleet would be vulnerable. In war, Germany could cut off oil supplies and cripple the Royal Navy. This was unacceptable. So Britain faced a multi-layered threat. The railway would undermine British control over trade routes. It would give Germany access to resources that Britain needed. It would turn the Ottoman Empire into a viable power, and it would do all of this without Britain being able to intervene using its traditional tool of naval power. Britain had spent 3 centuries building a system where it controlled the world by controlling the seas, and now Germany was building a system that made the seas irrelevant. The British response was carefully calibrated. Britain couldn't just invade the Ottoman Empire. That would trigger a European war, and in 1900, Britain wasn't ready for that. Britain couldn't just buy out the railway concession. Deutsche Bank had spent years negotiating the deal, and the Ottomans weren't going to tear it up just because Britain objected. So Britain pursued a strategy of escalating pressure, diplomatic intervention, financial sabotage, internationalization, support for internal Ottoman enemies, propaganda campaigns to portray the railway as a German plot to dominate the world. Each tool would be deployed in sequence, and when one failed, Britain would escalate to the next. The first target was money. The Berlin-Baghdad Railway required enormous capital, far more than Deutsche Bank could provide alone. Therefore, Deutsche Bank needed to raise funds by selling bonds to investors in London and Paris. But if Britain and France refused to allow their citizens to buy German railway bonds, the project would be starved of capital, and that's exactly what Britain did. In 1903, the British government quietly informed British banks that purchasing Berlin-Baghdad railway bonds would be considered an unfriendly act. The message was clear: Finance this railway and you'll face consequences. French banks, which often followed Britain's lead, did the same. As a result, Deutsche Bank couldn't raise the capital it needed. But Germany kept building anyway. Deutsche Bank found alternative financing through German and Austrian investors, and construction continued, albeit more slowly, which meant Britain needed to escalate. The second target was the route itself. The Berlin-Baghdad Railway needed to reach the Persian Gulf to fulfill its purpose. But the original plan was to extend the line from Baghdad to Basra and then to a port city on the Gulf, probably Kuwait. Therefore, in 1899, Britain signed a secret treaty with the Sheikh of Kuwait, promising British protection in exchange for the Sheikh agreeing not to allow any foreign power to build infrastructure in Kuwait without British permission. When Germany proposed extending the railway to Kuwait, the Sheikh said no, because Britain had forbidden it. Germany protested, but there was nothing they could do. Kuwait was now a British protectorate in all but name. This was classic imperial strategy. Britain didn't need to control all the territory along the railway route. Britain just needed to control the terminus. Because if the railway couldn't reach the Gulf, it couldn't connect to maritime trade routes, which meant it couldn't fulfill its economic purpose. Germany could build a railway from Berlin to Baghdad, but it would be a railway to nowhere because Baghdad wasn't on the coast. The value of the railway depended on that last connection to the sea, and Britain had blocked it. But blocking the terminus wasn't enough. The railway still represented a threat to British influence in Mesopotamia and Persia, even if it never reached tidewater. Germany was establishing economic and military ties with the Ottoman Empire. German advisors were training Ottoman troops. German engineers were surveying oil fields. Therefore, Britain tried a third approach. If it couldn't stop the railway, it would try to dilute it. The third target was diplomacy, forcing the project into a multilateral framework so Germany couldn't monopolize the corridor. Britain pushed to internationalize the railway question through negotiations and shared stakes, turning a German-Ottoman artery into something Britain could monitor, influence, and, if necessary, veto. In other words, if Britain couldn't kill the railway outright, it would try to put its hands on the steering wheel. But even that wasn't enough. Germany continued construction. The Ottoman Empire remained Germany's ally. The railway, though delayed and incomplete, was still advancing kilometer by kilometer toward Baghdad, which meant all of Britain's pressure tactics had only slowed the project. They hadn't stopped it. Therefore, Britain escalated again. The fourth target was the Ottomans themselves. Britain began cultivating relationships with Arab leaders inside the Ottoman Empire, particularly in the Arabian Peninsula and Mesopotamia. These were the same territories that the railway would pass through. British agents, operating out of Cairo and Bombay, made contact with tribal chiefs and religious leaders who resented Ottoman rule. Britain offered them money, weapons, and promises of independence. The message was simple: help us weaken the Ottoman government, and we'll help you get rid of the Turks. This wasn't altruism. Britain had no intention of allowing the Arabs to establish independent states on their own terms. But in the short term, Arab revolts would make the Ottoman Empire ungovernable, which meant it would be impossible for Germany to build and secure the railway through unstable territory. Therefore, in the long term, once the Ottoman Empire collapsed, Britain could carve up the Arab territories into colonial possessions or puppet states that would never threaten British interests. The fifth target was public opinion. British newspapers began publishing articles about the German menace, warning that Germany was plotting to conquer the East. The Berlin-Baghdad Railway was portrayed not as an economic project but as a military threat, the first step in a German plan to invade India. This was absurd on its face. The railway was 1,200 miles from India, and German military planners had never seriously proposed invading India by land. But the propaganda worked. British public opinion turned against Germany. Politicians who advocated negotiating with Germany over the railway were attacked as appeasers. The narrative became fixed. Germany was an enemy, and the railway was proof of German aggression. But even this wasn't enough. Germany continued construction. The Ottoman Empire remained Germany's ally. The railway, though delayed and incomplete, was still advancing, which meant all of Britain's pressure tactics, all the financial sabotage and diplomatic maneuvering, had only slowed the project. They hadn't stopped it. Therefore, Britain faced a stark choice: accept that the railway would eventually be completed, or find a way to destroy the Ottoman Empire entirely. By 1910, the British campaign was working. The railway was years behind schedule. Deutsche Bank was running out of money. The Ottoman government was paralyzed by debt and internal opposition. Only short sections of the railway had been completed, and the critical link from Baghdad to Basra remained unfinished. Britain was buying time. Every negotiation was a delay tactic. Every diplomatic concession was theater. Because the British understood something fundamental, agreements are only real as long as you can enforce them. Rails enforce themselves. Once the final rail segment connected to the Gulf, none of these paper agreements would matter anymore. The railway would exist, and Britain's control over trade routes would be broken. Therefore, the railway was dying a slow death, strangled by British financial and diplomatic pressure. But the British weren't satisfied with slow death. They wanted certainty, which meant eliminating not just the railway, but the entire framework that made the railway possible. That forced a stark conclusion: destroying the Ottoman Empire. The British had been waiting for the Ottoman Empire to collapse for 50 years, but collapse wasn't happening fast enough. The Ottoman state was weak, but it was resilient. Every time it seemed on the verge of falling apart, the Ottomans managed to stabilize. In 1908, the Young Turk Revolution had actually strengthened the empire by replacing the autocratic regime of Abdul Hamid with a constitutional government that promised modernization and reform. The new government was nationalist, which meant it was even more determined to resist European interference. From Britain's perspective, this was the worst possible outcome. The Ottoman Empire wasn't collapsing, it was reforming, which meant a reformed Ottoman Empire, allied with Germany and connected by railway to Europe, would be a major power. Britain needed a different approach. If the Ottoman Empire wouldn't collapse on its own, it would have to be destroyed. But you can't just invade an empire without a good reason. You need a pretext, a crisis that justifies military intervention. Therefore, World War I provided exactly that opportunity. Here's the uncomfortable truth that historians rarely emphasize. World War I wasn't an accident. It wasn't the result of a series of unintended escalations following the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. It was the culmination of deliberate policies pursued by the great powers, and particularly by Britain, to resolve strategic problems that couldn't be resolved through diplomacy. For Britain, the strategic problem was Germany, and Germany's power rested on its alliance with the Ottoman Empire and the potential of the Berlin-Baghdad Railway. Therefore, the only way to eliminate that threat permanently was through war. Britain had been preparing for war with Germany since at least 1906, when the British Foreign Office began discussing the need for a balance of power coalition to contain German expansion. Britain reached agreements with France in 1904 and Russia in 1907, forming what became known as the Triple Entente. These weren't defensive alliances. These were agreements to coordinate policy against Germany. The French wanted revenge for their defeat in the Franco-Prussian War and wanted to reclaim Alsace-Lorraine. The Russians wanted to expand their influence in the Balkans. And Britain wanted to destroy Germany's ability to challenge British naval supremacy and British control over global trade routes. The assassination of Franz Ferdinand in June 1914 was the spark, but the wood had been stacked for years. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Russia mobilized to defend Serbia. Germany declared war on Russia to support Austria. France declared war on Germany to support Russia. And Britain declared war on Germany, officially because Germany invaded Belgium, but really because this was the opportunity Britain had been waiting for. War with Germany meant war with the Ottoman Empire, because the Ottomans were Germany's ally. And war with the Ottoman Empire meant Britain could finally do what it had wanted to do for 15 years: seize control of Mesopotamia, shut down the Berlin-Baghdad Railway, and carve up the Middle East into territories that would never threaten British interests again. When Britain wanted to kill the railway, it didn't send lawyers. It sent troops. Look at what Britain did in the first months of the war. British forces invaded Mesopotamia, landing at Basra in November 1914. The official justification was to protect British oil interests in Persia and secure India's western flank from potential Ottoman attack. But the Ottoman forces in Mesopotamia posed no credible invasion threat to India. The distance was too great, the logistics impossible, and Ottoman military capacity was already overstretched. Therefore, the scale and direction of the British invasion only makes sense if the objective was infrastructure denial. Britain was seizing the southern terminus of the Berlin-Baghdad Railway. If Britain controlled Basra, the railway could never reach the Gulf. British forces also invaded Palestine and Syria, advancing from Egypt with the goal of capturing Jerusalem and Damascus. These weren't defensive operations. These were conquests, planned and executed with the explicit purpose of dismantling the Ottoman Empire. Meanwhile, Britain was coordinating with Arab leaders who wanted independence from Ottoman rule. In 1916, the British High Commissioner in Egypt, Henry McMahon, sent letters to Sharif Hussein of Mecca promising British support for an independent Arab state if Hussein launched a revolt against the Ottomans. Hussein agreed. The Arab revolt began in June 1916, led by Hussein's son Faisal and advised by a British intelligence officer named T.E. Lawrence, who would later become famous as Lawrence of Arabia. Lawrence later admitted the revolt was being used as a tool to break Ottoman control and shape what came after. The details of independence were always negotiable in London. At the same time, Britain was making deals with France to divide Ottoman territories. The Sykes-Picot Agreement, signed in secret in May 1916, carved up the Middle East into British and French zones of influence. Britain would get Mesopotamia, which gave Britain control over the oil fields and the railway route. France would get Syria and Lebanon. Palestine would be under international administration. And while they were writing these rules about who controlled what railway lines and oil fields, they were making completely different promises to the people actually living under them. The agreement was kept secret from the Arabs, who believed they were fighting for independence, not for a change of colonial masters. And then there was the oil. In 1914, just months before the war started, the British government purchased a controlling stake in the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, making oil a strategic national interest. Winston Churchill, who was First Lord of the Admiralty, argued that Britain needed to secure access to Persian and Mesopotamian oil to fuel the Royal Navy. The invasion of Mesopotamia wasn't just about stopping the railway. It was about seizing the oil fields that Germany had hoped to access through the railway. The war dragged on for 4 years, but by 1918 the outcome was clear. The Ottoman Empire was defeated. British forces occupied Mesopotamia, Palestine, and parts of Syria. French forces occupied Lebanon and northern Syria. The Berlin-Baghdad Railway, partially completed, was now under British control in the south and would never be extended to the Gulf. Germany was defeated, stripped of its overseas colonies, and forbidden from ever again projecting power beyond Europe. The Ottoman Empire was dismembered. In 1920, the League of Nations formalized the partition of the Middle East through the mandate system. Britain received mandates over Iraq, Palestine, and Transjordan. France received mandates over Syria and Lebanon. These weren't colonies, officially. They were mandates, which meant that Britain and France were supposed to be preparing these territories for independence. But in practice, they were colonies in all but name. Britain and France controlled the governments, the militaries, the economies, and the borders. And the borders were drawn with deliberate precision to ensure that no unified state could ever challenge British or French power. Iraq was created by combining 3 Ottoman provinces: Basra in the south, Baghdad in the center, and Mosul in the north. These provinces had little in common. Basra was mostly Shia Arab. Baghdad was mixed, Sunni and Shia. Mosul was mostly Kurdish. But putting them together in one state guaranteed internal conflict and made it impossible for Iraq to develop a coherent national identity, which meant Iraq would be too busy managing sectarian tensions to ever threaten British oil interests. Syria and Lebanon were split apart, even though they had been a single province under Ottoman rule. The split ensured that Syria would be landlocked and economically weak, while Lebanon would be too small to be a major power. Transjordan was created out of empty desert, given to one of the sons of Sharif Hussein as a consolation prize for the promises Britain had broken. Palestine was reserved for special treatment, with Britain promising both the Arabs and the Jews that they would get the territory, ensuring a conflict that persists to this day. This wasn't accidental. This was imperial engineering. The borders were drawn to create states that would be internally divided, economically dependent on Europe, and militarily incapable of threatening British interests. The Middle East was transformed from a region that could have been unified by infrastructure into a patchwork of weak, antagonistic states that would spend the next century fighting each other instead of challenging European power. And the Berlin-Baghdad Railway? It was never completed as originally envisioned. The sections that existed were taken over by the British and French, who operated them as colonial infrastructure. The dream of a land route connecting Europe to the Persian Gulf died with the Ottoman Empire. Germany was forbidden by the Treaty of Versailles from ever again investing in Middle Eastern infrastructure. The railway that was supposed to bypass British power ended up as a British possession, a trophy of imperial conquest. This is the history that doesn't get taught. We're told that World War I was about nationalism, about the balance of power, about entangling alliances, and those factors mattered, certainly. But the deeper story, the story that explains why Britain was so eager to go to war, why Britain pursued the dismemberment of the Ottoman Empire with such ruthless efficiency, that story is about infrastructure and trade routes. Britain went to war to destroy a railway line because that railway line threatened the entire foundation of British imperial power. Look at the Middle East today. The borders drawn by Britain and France in 1920 are still the borders that define the region. Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, these are all artificial states created by European powers to serve European interests. The conflicts we see in the news, the wars in Iraq and Syria, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the sectarian violence between Sunnis and Shias, all of this traces back to the decisions made by Britain and France after World War I. The Middle East was deliberately fragmented to ensure it would never become a unified power bloc, and it worked. For 100 years, the Middle East has been unable to develop the kind of integrated infrastructure that would allow it to control its own resources and trade. Oil gets extracted by foreign companies and shipped to foreign markets. Trade routes are still controlled by external powers. The region remains divided, weak, and dependent on Europe and America for technology, capital, and military protection. This is exactly what Britain wanted in 1914. The goal wasn't just to stop one railway line. The goal was to ensure that no railway line, no road, no infrastructure project would ever again threaten European control over the routes between Europe and Asia. And if you think this is ancient history, watch what happens whenever a rising power tries to build a route that bypasses the hegemon's choke points. The names change, the logic doesn't. That's the lesson of the Berlin-Baghdad Railway. It wasn't just a railway. It was a challenge to the entire architecture of global power. And Britain's response, the destruction of the Ottoman Empire and the creation of the modern Middle East, shows what happens when a hegemon feels threatened. They don't negotiate, they don't compromise. They destroy, they remake the world to eliminate the threat, and they call it progress. Somewhere in the desert, a stretch of track ends abruptly. Not because the engineers failed, but because empires intervened. So, when you hear about World War I, remember this. It wasn't just about a Serbian assassin or European nationalism. It was about a railway line that Britain couldn't allow to exist. And when you look at the Middle East today, at the borders that make no sense, at the conflicts that never seem to end, remember that these borders were drawn deliberately by British officials in London and Cairo for the explicit purpose of ensuring that the region would never be strong enough to challenge Western control. History didn't turn on a gunshot in Sarajevo. It turned on a rail line that threatened to bypass an empire. The Berlin-Baghdad Railway was stopped, the Ottoman Empire was destroyed, and the Middle East has been paying the price ever since.